Label it as Solidago SP, which just stands for species, because we have 3 or 4 different species of goldenrod in Maryland here, and they're all good enough. If you really want to get into the nitty gritty, there's a little bit of research out there. There's people arguing of like, this species is better medicine than that species. But there isn't that much out there on it at this point, and I use them all interchangeably, and it seems good enough.
What's the best resources you could find to like ID the different Solidagos?
Just for IDing them?
Yeah.
We can put, I have some books that are keys.
Yeah.
If you've ever used an actual key before, not just a field guide, keys are usually the best way to do it. Right. You know, they get really deep really fast.
I know.
You open a page and you're like, oh, I have to learn my botany terms. But yeah, if you really want to get into the specifics that way, some of them are easy. Like there is a species of goldenrod here. The common name is just early goldenrod, and that's because it tends to bloom before all the others, and it also happens to tend to grow much shorter than the others. So like that one is kind of like visually stands out pretty easily. But again, for the most part, I'm just like goldenrod, Solidago species, good enough.
It sounds like it's an aggressive invasive too, correct? It's considered.
It is native. It will cluster like this and bunch. I am totally fine with that, especially in the rows, because this is an interesting plant where it tends to produce a lot more biomass above the ground than below the ground. These don't have massive root systems. The root systems are kind of small and compacted. So this is nice to have. It will shade out other things that I would consider much more weeds. Like I don't want grass right at the base of my trees, because the roots of the grass will really compete with the roots of my tree. They take up a lot of space. These underground don't take up as much space, won't compete as much with the roots of my tree, but above ground, they do take up a lot of space. They'll shade out other things. They're an excellent source of food for all kinds of pollinators, for all wild pollinators, but also like I keep honeybees up here to help with pollination of the apple trees. But apples are blooming for like 2 weeks max, you know. That's not enough for the bees to be healthy. I need to make sure that there's always a source of food for them. And so especially in the fall, this is excellent. Here is a beautiful example, 2 ladybugs mating. And so again, probably a great case of, you know, they're finding food, they're eating my pests, but instead of having to go somewhere else to find a mate or find a safe place to lay eggs, they can do it right here. That's another good reason that I like goldenrod. It's an excellent habitat for a lot of organisms. If you leave it all winter long, it'll dry out and the stalks will remain. It won't completely fall back to the ground, which again, all throughout the winter, really good habitat for organisms. These stalks are hard enough that they'll dry out and they'll remain standing. And there's a lot of insects, including wasps, that will like bore a hole into the stalk and they'll survive the winter in there. So if you can leave it, great. But also if you can harvest it, great. You can take the blooms themselves to make a tea. You can also take the leaves. You tend to want to go for the uppermost section. You'll notice on each of these, it tends to be a single stalk here. Or actually, can I just pull it out? Yeah. So that's the unbroken root system of this.
Wow.
So again, like not as much going on underground as above ground. So like really good for these in-between spaces where like I just don't want grass here basically. So grow something else. So not as much going on underground, a lot going up above. It'll always be this single stalk, and once it gets up and it gets ready to flower, it'll start branching off. In terms of harvesting it, I usually just stick with that upper part. I'll go to right where it starts branching.
And you make tea out of it.
Yeah, and I'll make the tea. That's mainly just like, this material is not as concentrated in what you want out of the tea, and it's just thicker and woodier, harder to deal with. But yeah, this whole thing I would take for the tea. You can have it fresh or dried. For the flowers, people tend to have them dried. But keep in mind, as it is drying, these nice tiny little flowers can basically turn into dust. So like once it's dried and you're going to, you know, process it and put it into a bag, you just have to be careful, because like if you accidentally shake this, then it'll just all go on the ground immediately. So if you're drying it, careful when you're harvesting it that way. But yeah, I'll cut it from there. I usually won't keep the stems. I'll just pick off the leaves and dry them separately. with the flowers.
But are the flowers edible?
They are, yeah. I mean, I've seen people that straight up just use the flowers as like a garnish in food.
Okay.
I've seen people even try to candy them. The most common thing I do with it is tea, though.
Okay.
You can have it fresh, which is what we're going to try today, and you'll definitely get a sense for the character of it as a tea. But the flavor and effect of it really seems to get ramped up when it dries. Yeah. So.
Any like medicinal uses for it?
Yeah, I'll get into that more when we're having the tea. But in general, as with a lot of herbal remedies, you can read a lot of different opinions online about what it does. In my personal experience, it is really good for general illnesses like cold or flu as an expectorant. You know, if I got a lot of phlegm going on, I feel like it helps loosen everything up. You know, it might encourage me to sweat a little bit. There's some research about it having beneficial effects cleaning your liver out. I don't know as much about that, and you know, that's usually not something of like, wow, I took tea and my liver feels so much better. You don't notice that effect as much.
What is this insect here? There's so many.
Yes. And that is another beautiful thing. The closer you look, the more life you're going to see going on.
For sure.
Oh, yeah, those. Oh.
They're so magic.